Thank you for joining me as I conclude my examination of the book In Search of God by Robert Hawes. In this video, I will finish up part 3 of the book. We'll run through the second half of it, and then I'll also briefly cover a little bit of the concluding material in the first appendix of the book, and then we'll be done. We'll be completely done with our examination of In Search of God. So let's get started by jumping back into part 3, which I remind you is titled The Serpent in the Garden, Reconciling the Person of God with the Problem of Evil. And still on the subject of the problem of evil, at this point, Hawes turns to examine that problem from the perspective of individuals who are suffering. He goes from big picture to down on the ground. What does the problem of evil look like, and what answers are there for the problem of evil to a person who is experiencing suffering and pain, or has been the object, the victim of some kind of evil deed or evil occurrence in their lives? Why does God allow this? Why does God allow these tragedies to befall people who have done nothing to deserve them? Why does God allow, for instance, babies to be stillborn? What's the purpose of that? Why does God allow families' lives to be destroyed by natural disasters? What possible justification could there be for that? Well, quote, in some situations, it may be that He, meaning God, wishes to redirect our attention from things and even people to what is truly important, our relationship with Him and our readiness to face judgment. I've heard many testimonies offered by those who lost possessions or even loved ones and were unable to understand why such things happened to them until, in the clarity of hindsight, they came to realize that their entire world had revolved around those things and people, the loss of which forced them to reevaluate their lives and their relationship with God, as they might otherwise never have done. They emerged better for it, painful though the experience was, and long though the lesson often was in coming. So, God allows, or perhaps causes, tragedies to befall us in order to teach us lessons, or to remind us of the importance of staying close to Him. This might be a valid excuse if we assume that God is weak and incompetent. But most Christians would insist that God is not weak and incompetent, but all-powerful and perfect. That being the case, Hawes and the countless others who have made this same argument throughout the centuries. In this case, Hawes is not being creative. In previous parts of the book, he's actually somewhat impressed me with how creatively he was able to construct these tired old arguments to make them seem kind of fresh, but this is just boilerplate. Bad things happen to good people because God has lessons to teach us. And whether it's Robert Hawes making that argument, or any of the countless Christians, apologists, preachers, evangelists who have made this exact same excuse, they're all expecting us to believe that the best way God can think of to teach humanity important lessons is to allow us to suffer, or perhaps to inflict that suffering upon us. The omnipotent, omniscient God of the universe notices that a particular woman has become a little too materialistic. God thinks to himself, how can I remind this beloved creation of mine that it's ultimately not possessions that matter, but her relationship with me? I know. I'll smash her house to splinters in a tornado. That'll teach her. Or worse yet, note that in the passage I just quoted, Hawes mentions people who lost possessions and loved ones. And after suffering their losses, they realized their lives had revolved too much around those things and those people. So with that in mind, maybe the omnipotent, omniscient God of the universe notices that a particular man is getting a little too attached to his kids. He never misses a band concert or a t-ball game, but it's been years since he's been to church. How can I call this wayward sheep back to my flock? God wonders. I know. I'll have his kid's school bus run off the side of a bridge and the kids will drown. That'll remind him how much I love him. Oh, and maybe the parents of the other children on the bus who will also drown will learn a lesson too. That's no biggie if they don't, because I'm not really worried about them. I'm only worried about those particular 2 kids that I'm going to drown in the school bus. This is what we must believe in order to accept this argument, that the God who created the universe, the God who holds all of creation in His hands, The God who knows everything, who is bound by nothing, is unable to call people to his side and cause them to know him better without inflicting pain on some of them. Or maybe he is able, but he allows people to suffer and die for his own reasons, reasons he does not see fit to share with us. Quote, all of this goes back to our limited knowledge and corrupted nature, and it presents us with a choice. We can either trust that God knows best, humble ourselves, and yield to him, as painful as that may sometimes be, or we can sink into growing despair and frustrated anger until we come to hate him. Yep, and I refuse to devote my life to serving such a God. The God of the Bible, as conceived by Christians like Hawes, is so odious that his existence or non-existence is almost beside the point. Because I would feel the same whether I thought he existed or not. A God who knows everything and can do anything is presenting us a choice. Either yield to him as he forces us to suffer while refusing to allow us to understand why it's necessary at the very least, or go to hell. Literally, go to hell and suffer forever. That is the choice that this omnipotent, omniscient God is presenting us. I misspoke earlier when I said that the God of the Bible is bound by nothing. If you watched the previous video in this series, you know that Hawes believes that God is limited by one thing, and that is his own nature. And maybe that's the best answer to the question of why God allows suffering when it is entirely within his power to prevent it. It's his nature. It's his nature to be callous, demanding, threatening, and cruel. This is the God we're supposed to trust and love and serve. No. No. Or have I judged God too harshly? That's possible, I suppose. According to Hawes, God is just as affected by the world's pain and tragedy as we are. Quote, God is intimately aware of everything that goes on in this universe, all of which he continually upholds, sustains by his own power. Not only does he see every evil thing that happens, but he is there for every minute of it, knowing it in its full horror as we never could. And if we think that these things make us angry, sinful as we are, try to imagine the indignation that a perfectly pure, righteous, and loving God must experience when his nature requires him to continually see and hear mankind at its worst, second by second, day by day, year after year. Yes, evil and suffering might be bad for you, but won't you think about God for a minute? I mean, we're suffering, but God has to watch us suffer. Actually, no, he doesn't. He could end the suffering. He chooses to watch us suffer, but he must have a good reason. You know, I have to hand it to Hawes. Up to this point, as I mentioned a moment ago, I've appreciated the effort that he sometimes puts into constructing his arguments, because he's not really saying anything new, but he's at least finding new ways to serve the same old leftovers. His argument that reason is irreducibly complex, for instance. Basically, the same bad argument I've heard 100 times before, but it's presented in a way that is at least creative and somewhat novel. I've heard lots of irreducible complexity arguments made about particular organs of the body or particular life forms, but I've never heard one about reason itself. So that's at least somewhat new to me. But this think of how suffering affects God business. When I read this through for the first time as I was writing this video, I genuinely was not prepared for that. It's been a while since I read a passage in one of these apologetics books that I do these series about that I found so utterly repugnant. Let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that the God Hawes is describing exists. Hawes is asking us to believe that this God is affected just as much by our suffering as we are. Actually, no. He's asking us to believe that God is affected by it more than we are. This God, who faces no danger, who lives with no uncertainty, who has no idea what it feels like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of forces you don't understand and can't control, who has never lost anything and is actually incapable of losing anything. This God knows our suffering and pain better than we do, supposedly. Although, in fairness, that's not actually what Hawes is saying. He didn't mention that God felt our pain or that God feels the same way about our suffering as we do. He said it makes God angry, and somehow that's supposed to mean more to us than our own suffering or the suffering of our fellow humans. If we imagine that this God exists, and we say, why, God, why do you allow these awful things to happen to people, to innocent people, to children, to helpless people? Why do you allow these awful things to happen to us? And the response, not from God, of course, but from one of God's self-appointed surrogates, like Robert Hawes, the answer is, well, if you think that's bad, just think how angry God is about all of this. Think how angry God is about the suffering we inflict on each other. Not angry enough to do something about it. Not angry enough even to inform us about why this sort of thing is necessary, why he has chosen to allow it to continue when it is fully within his power to stop it. Not angry enough to do any of that, but trust me, ooh, God, he's so angry about it. You know, sometimes when we feel bad, someone will respond by saying, well, remember that there are people in the world who have it a lot worse off than you do. You know, when I was a kid, if I complained about the food that my mother had cooked for dinner, or I was just sort of picking at my plate and didn't seem very hungry or excited by supper, my mother or my father would sometimes say to me, you know, there are starving children in Africa. And sometimes this tactic is justified, I guess. Maybe the person complaining is just making a fuss over nothing and needs to have things placed in perspective. Sometimes it's not justified. Maybe the person complaining has a legitimate grievance, but they're being basically told to shut up by someone who doesn't want to hear about it. Whether it's justified or not, at least the people being referred to do actually have it pretty bad. Whether my complaints about the quality of the food my mother cooked me were valid or not, then and now I would be hard-pressed to disagree that the impoverished, malnourished people of Malawi, for instance, have it much, much worse than I do. But Hawes isn't saying, think about the starving children before you complain. He's saying, think of how God feels before you complain. He might as well be saying to a person living in destitution, hey, you think you've got problems? Think of the poor billionaires. The shit they have to put up with. You have no idea. Christians have been guilt-tripping people, mostly each other, with think of how God feels, with that guilt trip rap for centuries. And it often takes the form of the assertion that Jesus suffered for our sins, which I think is no less a load of bullshit than what Hawes has written here. Jesus, who was never in any danger, who was only dead in a sense for 3 days, and who returned from death to rule over the universe in glory, does not know what human fear and pain and suffering feels like. He couldn't possibly. But let's say God does feel our pain. Let's say he sees all the evil and suffering in the world, and it really truly affects him. It doesn't just make him mad. Let's say he really knows how we feel. How does that help his case in terms of the problem of evil? Not only is he aware of our suffering, he knows exactly how we feel. He experiences our pain himself, and still he allows it to continue, without even bothering to make us understand why. Sorry, no. This God isn't for me. I will just wait for the next one. Thank you. Hawes is saving the best response to the problem of evil for last, though, because apparently the best response is to toss it aside and insist we consider a different problem altogether, a problem that puts us under scrutiny instead of God. Quote, when we consider our fallen states, the evils we nurse within ourselves, and the things we do to one another in this world, the problem of evil pales in significance to what might be called the problem of grace. For why should God love us at all? What motivates him to extend anything good to those who have done so much evil and have offended him so grievously. Well, this is what you get when you propose a God who cannot be held accountable for anything he does, because he is the ultimate authority. You get self-hating sophistry like this. Consider for a moment how utterly depraved and misanthropic this is. Again, let's imagine, just for the sake of argument, that this God exists. Why should God love us at all? Because he created us. We didn't ask to be created. We had no choice in the matter, and ultimately we have no power and no control over what happens to us. We are just here. And we are mortal, and we are ignorant, and we are impotent. And in many cases, we are experiencing pain and suffering on a continuous basis. And the question is, why should God love us? That's backwards. The question should be, why should we love God? Why should we love a God who creates us to suffer, despite having the power to spare us that suffering? Why should we love a God who creates us ignorant and leaves us that way, despite having the power to make himself known and understood perfectly to all of us? Why should we love a God who inflicts pain and suffering and death on ourselves and the people we love in order to force us closer to him? These acts don't warrant love, because these are not acts of love. These are acts of abuse. And if any parent, if any human parent, treated their child the way the God of the Bible treats us, we would demand justice. Our hearts would be filled with love and sympathy for those children, and with fury directed at that parent. And yet, that parent would at least have the minimal excuse of being a limited, imperfect, fearful, broken human like the rest of us. Limited and completely inadequate to excuse the crimes, but nonetheless, at least there would be that much. With God, what's his excuse? What excuse could the all-knowing, all-powerful, eternal, perfect God of the universe have for watching his creations live, suffer, and die in fear and ignorance for generations? And I haven't even mentioned hell yet. Because not only does this supremely powerful God allow us to suffer during our relatively brief mortal lives, he condemns all but a tiny fraction of us to experience torments after we die that will last forever. And why? Because we aren't good enough. Because we don't meet God's standard. God, who made us, who is responsible for us being as we are, judges us to be unfit to live in his presence. And who does the perfect God of the universe hold responsible for this? Himself? Who made us this way? No. He holds us responsible. And it is us who will either pick the one right religion or will pay for being made this way by existing in a state of agony forever. I'm disgusted and offended by this. And to me, this is little more than an intellectual exercise. I'm an atheist. I don't think the God proposed by Robert Hawes exists, nor does any other God. But this isn't an intellectual exercise to everyone. We atheists, in our zeal to argue and debate and refute and debunk, often forget this. Even a philosophical question like the problem of evil is not merely an exercise. To many, it's a very real source of confusion and grief. There are parents who have lost a child to an illness or an accident or an act of violence. There are people whose homes have been destroyed by tornadoes or floods or earthquakes or bombs. There are people who are sick, who are impoverished, who are desperate, who are afraid, who suffer through no fault of their own in circumstances beyond their power to change. And they ask themselves, or maybe they ask their friends or their priests, why? Why does God allow these things to happen? What could I possibly have done to deserve this? What could my child have done? And at best, the Christian answer is, I don't know. At best, at its most humane and compassionate and self-aware and honest, a Christian can offer the same response that any sensitive, caring person of any faith or no faith could offer. I don't know. It doesn't make sense. I'm so sorry. I'm here for you. How can I help? At best. At worst, the Christian answer is, well, God has his reasons, but it's probably at least a little bit your fault. I've said before, the play never changes. God gets the credit, we get the blame. And it's bad enough to encounter that attitude in a setting like this, where the stakes are relatively low. To say something like that to a person who is actually suffering, who is actually experiencing loss and grief and uncertainty, is unconscionable. I don't know if people who promote such a view of God and of humanity as Hawes is presenting here realize how cruel it really is. And I hope they don't realize it, by the way. I hope that they're blinded by their good intentions and by the faith they cherish but rarely bother to critically examine. I hope that they're inflicting this cruelty on other people without realizing it. The God they mean to serve has no such excuse. Well, that's actually it for part 3. But before I wrap up the video and the series, I do want to touch on one point from the concluding material in the book. There are a couple of appendices in the book, and the second appendix just is sort of a restatement of the attributes that God would have to have according to Hawes, and we covered most of that actually in part 1 of this book, so I'm just going to pass that up. But in the first appendix, Appendix A, Hawes addresses the question, why would a perfect God require worship? And that's an excellent question, and one that I have asked myself on many different occasions, so let's see what Hawes has to say. First, Hawes clarifies what is meant by worship. In this context, to worship God means to show reverence toward God, because God is our superior, to sort of be reverent and to pay homage to our superior God. And why would God demand this of us? Quote, as the creator of all things, the one who gives us life, the one in whose image we are made, the only perfect being there is, God is deserving of our veneration. The glory for these things rightfully belongs to him, and he has declared that he will not share that glory with anyone else. He does not call for our veneration out of arrogant self-indulgence. On the contrary, by calling for our worship, he is defending that which is rightfully his. And he does this because to do otherwise would be to suppress the truth of who he is and what he has done. It would result in unjustly lowering himself and elevating man. And why would God give a shit about that? Hawes says that God is defending what is rightfully his. Defending it against whom? Against us? Because we have no power to take from God that which is rightfully his. The unjust lowering of God and elevating of man would only be in the eyes of man. Surely, God would still see himself as superior, and since God's perspective is the ultimate perspective, according to Hawes, God's superiority would remain an objective fact, even if humans somehow got the idea that he was slightly lower and we were slightly higher. The question of why God would care remains. Also, if our veneration means that much to him, why doesn't God just simply reveal himself to everyone, unambiguously, so that we could all behold his glory? Surely being able to behold our Creator so that we could no longer deny his greatness would be all the encouragement we would need to venerate him, right? I mean, even a smug atheist know-it-all like me would have no choice but to bow before his irresistibly splendid presence, right? So what's with all the petulant Old Testament demands for respect and loyalty? If he's got the goods, let him show us the goods. If that's really a gun in his pocket and not just his finger, then let everyone see, and then it'll be settled. But see, according to the Bible, I don't think that would solve the problem either. Because in the Old Testament, there are stories where God reveals himself to humans, where he comes down to earth and he's talking to people. Adam and Eve knew God. They still fucked with him. They still disobeyed. Moses knew God. Moses was renowned as the man who got to talk to God. Moses still fucked with him. Moses still showed him disrespect from time to time. So God must not be all that impressive. I mean, if you go by the Old Testament God and you read it the way people like Robert Hawes typically read it, God must not be that impressive of a guy, even in person. Because if God shows up in person in front of you and tells you to do stuff, and then you still don't do it, or you give him some shit while you're doing it, or you show him some attitude like he's just any other person, God must not be that impressive. He must not be nearly as impressive as he says he is. Because, according to the Bible, people who saw him, who hung out with him, who got to know him on a one-to-one basis, were still kind of like, oh, God, can't deal with him today. But anyway, God, according to Hawes and according to many Christians, does plan on revealing himself to us eventually. And maybe it's just maybe with Moses and with Adam and Eve, it just got lost in translation. Maybe when God had to assume a physical form to talk to people on earth back in the day, it wasn't quite impressive because you weren't getting the full God. So after Judgment Day, or whenever it's supposed to happen, when we're standing before the presence of God, in the realm of God, in the afterlife, in paradise, whatever you want to call it, maybe that's when it'll answer all of our questions. We will behold God in all of his true, full, ultimate glory, and then we will know. But if that's the plan, why does he give a shit what we think about him now? Why doesn't he just wait until we get the full package? And then be like, yeah, see, I knew once you really got to know me, you'd respect me. Why doesn't he just do that? Why does he care what we think of him while we can only behold him in this very limited, imperfect form? It keeps coming back to the same question. Why does he care? I know. His ways are not our ways. That seems to be the only answer to any of these questions that God's self-appointed apologists, evangelists, defenders like Robert Hawes can come up with when pushed, when challenged, when their back is against the wall. Their only real answer to any of these arguments is, his ways are not our ways. I don't know, but I'm sure God has his reasons. And sorry, but that's just not good enough for me. Whether God exists or not, if there is a God or there isn't a God, that reeks of a weak excuse to me. And I demand more than that, especially if this God demands so much of me as he supposedly does. Well, that's it for this book. We're done. That's it for In Search of God. That's it for the Atheist Read series for the rest of the year. As I usually do, I am now going to take the rest of the year off. And on Thursday in my upload schedule, I will be doing Stephen Stuffy videos from starting next week till the end of the year. I'm really excited about it. And as I said at the end of the last series, if you don't ordinarily watch my Stephen Stuffy videos, I would invite you to check them out starting next week as they run through the rest of the year every Thursday on my channel, because they really are my favorite videos. They really are my favorite thing that I do. I love them like children. And I'm very proud of them and very pleased with them. So if you haven't watched them before, it might not be your cup of tea, you might not like them, but at least check it out. Let me know what you think. I will be back in January to start the Atheist Read series all over again. I do have the books picked out, but I haven't quite decided what order I'm going to do them in yet, so I'm not going to announce what the next title is yet. We still have many, many months to go until then. But if you enjoyed this series, if you have anything to say in response to what I've had to say, in my critique of In Search of God, please leave a comment on this video. Please let me know if you agree, disagree, whether you be a Christian or an atheist or something else entirely. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on what my thoughts have been about this book. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, subscribe, and if you really like this video and you really want to help me out and you can afford it, and you think I'm worth it, please consider helping me to continue making videos like this and like all the videos I make by becoming a supporter of this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron of this channel for as little as $1 a month. And if you pledge at $5 a month or more, I will give your name a shout out at the end of one of my Facepalm 5 videos. That's just a little bit of an extra incentive if you can afford it and you think I'm worth a $5 a month pledge rather than a $1 or $2, whatever. But any amount helps me out. There's no such thing as a pledge that is too small to be truly, truly appreciated. I'm grateful to all of my Patreon patrons who have supported me now for a couple of years. It's really amazing, and I could not do this without you folks. So thanks to all of you who support me in that way, and thanks to all of you who watch these videos, who get something out of it, who share them, who tell people to watch, who leave comments telling me, you know, how much you appreciate it. I cannot tell you how encouraging and how gratifying it is to know that this is of some use to you. So thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you next time.